Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. If we haven't met before, my name's Ed Shaw and I have the great privilege of being the ministry director of Living Out. In this series of the Living Out podcast, we're going through each chapter of my own book, The Plausibility Problem, published as Same-Sex Attraction and the Church in the US. And I think it's probably worth me clarifying that it wasn't my idea to go through my own book, but was a decision made independently by two colleagues who weren't out for a pay rise. Well, if they were out for a pay rise, they will fail to get it. But working through my book does give us a chance to talk through some of the missteps individuals, churches and society have taken when it comes to Christianity and sexuality. And today our focus is going to be on misstep number 3 from the book, the idea that if you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay. Helping me do that are my much younger friends and colleagues, Andrew and Ashley, who together make up our emerging generation team. And on the Living Out staff team, I like to see myself as a sort of in the middle between the emerging generation team, who the younger people, and then I think the submerging generation team, who the older people of Anne and Andy, who are significantly older from me. But anyway, back to the emerging generations team and Ashley and Andrew. Could you name something significant that happened in the year of your birth? Don't name the year. Just tell us the significant thing that happened in the year of your birth. Andrew first.
Well, I had to look into this, but it turns out the internet went public in the year of my birth. Invented a couple of years before in some kind of educational institution, wasn't it? But then it went out of that educational institution across many to went public in the year of my birth. I had no idea it was such a significant year.
Wow.
Ooh, I know. And I love the fact there'll be some people that immediately now know what year you were born in. Yeah. Others will be as, sort of clueless as I still am. Ashley, what about you? Something significant happened in the year of your birth?
Yeah, obviously I was born, and that was fairly significant.
Agreed.
I also had to look into this because, I didn't know anything else about the year of my birth. Apparently, there was a total solar eclipse that was more than 6 minutes long, and there will not be a longer total eclipse until 2132.
Ooh, wow.
So, an interesting fact for some people.
Okay, that is beginning to make me feel as if I might be part of the submerging generations team because I can remember that. Okay, my year of my birth, Queen, Her Majesty the Queen's late Majesty's Silver Jubilee.
I thought we say coronation. Okay,
no. Right, talking about people losing their jobs. Right, okay, let's move on to the main subject of our podcast now. As we talk, misstep number 3, the idea that if you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay, we're going to start by seeking just to understand the ideas contained in this misstep in chapter 3 of the Plausibility Problem, and then we're going to seek to apply them in the second half of the show. So let's just take this statement. If you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay. Do you feel that you were born gay, same-sex attracted, Andrew?
Well, in some sense, I guess, yes, in the sense that it's certainly something where I didn't choose and feels very innate to me. I mean, I've shared before, maybe even on this podcast, when I first began to experience same-sex attraction, I genuinely didn't have any idea what was going on. I don't think I knew people do sometimes find that they're same-sex attracted or gay. So it wasn't a choice. It came to my surprise, came very kind of naturally. So in one sense, yes. But then also, I kind of increasingly, as I do get slightly older, increasingly I'm just aware of how much I have been, and we are all shaped by our experiences, particularly early experiences, and just got loads of things I've learnt about myself and some things I've had to work through about myself of realising actually, the reality is our early experiences have a huge impact on us. That kind of thing of adulthood is recovering from childhood is kind of true for all of us. And so I also just see the plausibility of my environment and different things in my life potentially having impacted my sexuality, because I just see across my life how much, as we all experience in different ways, early experiences shape all manner of parts of us. So both a yes and. I can easily believe and feel I was born this way, but also easily believe that all manner of things in life could also have impacted my sexuality.
So sort of, we're touching there, aren't we, the whole nature-nurture thing. Give us a percentage. Nature-nurture, what do you think?
What, for me personally? I haven't got a clue.
But it's interesting, isn't it? It just you're wanting to recognise that both have interplayed to some extent in your developing sexuality.
That feels plausible, at least based on my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Actually, I think you describe yourself as bi or gay. Again, did that feel as if it just came naturally, or what?
Yeah, I could probably repeat what Andrew's just said, to be honest. I can believe the kind of, maybe I was born this way sort of argument, but also, maybe I can't think of any particular kind of standout childhood experiences or relationships or anything like that would have impacted me. It's definitely not something I chose, not something I asked for, something that does seem to have happened fairly naturally in my life. It's actually something I've spent a lot of time asking myself and or the Lord, like, why am I same-sex attracted? Why is this something that I have to wrestle with, I guess? And at times that question's really bothered me, but I've never really found, even with all my kind of probing and digging and trying to think back, never really found a particular answer to this question. Kind of can see the validity of all the different views and the different arguments there. But I will say that as time has gone on for me, this question has started to feel less relevant, and I think we're going to come on to discuss more as to why that might be.
It is interesting, isn't it, how so often people do have really strong theories on this, often attached to how they can make us right again. And I certainly had conversations with people who have, just attached a huge significance to just one thing about my story and said, oh, well, if you got that sorted, then you'll be fine. And they haven't sort of really interacted with the full sort of nature-nurture debate that we're beginning to touch on here, and how, nature, nurture are really key in all of this. But perhaps nature more than nurture, although I know that's quite a controversial thing. It's also probably worth saying that in the secular world, although this argument, if you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay, is a big thing, although there are a lot of people that say, you're born that way, there are also a lot of people who are wanting to say, actually, no, being gay is a choice, and it's a good choice. And if you're a radical liberal feminist, often you are saying something on the lines of, yes, I've chosen this. I've chosen to be a lesbian, to, as one of the many ways I'm seeking in my life to overthrow patriarchy in society. And certainly voices like Julie Bindel in the secular space massively saying, actually, no, it's a choice. This isn't something that you were born into. This is a radical choice to change a society.
I think it's also the case that Lisa Diamond said the same. Lisa Diamond is a lady who's done a lot of research on sexual fluidity, both in the sense of people's kind of sexual desires changing of their own accord in different kind of directions, but also their sexual practices over time changing a lot, and basically who they engage in sexual activity with. And she's been quite strong on basically, we've just got to throw away the kind of you're born this way argument, because she says it's just patently now not scientifically defensible. She's really quite strong on that, actually. And that's the interesting, it's not just a radical feminist idea, it's actually kind of based on kind of actual research of people's experiences and desires. She just thinks there's no solid foundation to use it as such a firm argument as it sometimes has been.
So if you want to sort of think about the science of this and you're listening, Google Lisa Diamond.
Yeah.
And if you want to think about the sort of radical lesbian perspective, Google Julie Bindel. But for now, we're going to think about just this whole idea that if our sexuality emerged naturally, if it feels like a sort of predetermined part of who we are, how can it be wrong to be gay, to be same-sex attracted, to bi, to live out who you are? And that's been, let's be honest, one of the most powerful arguments that have been used in Western society over the last 20, 30 years to say we've got to allow these people to be themselves. We've got to allow these people to enter into same-sex sexual relationships. We've got to allow same-sex marriage because they were born that way. How do we respond to that? Andrew, kick us off again.
Well, my first thought is, but we all know there are things that feel natural to us, come naturally to us, which we wouldn't say are good, and none of us would pretty much say we should act on. And so then the question becomes, okay, how do you account for that, actually? And most worldviews can't really account for that, I think, actually. But actually, the biblical story does give us the explanation. Why is it that we all experience things which seem to be drawing us into things that wouldn't be good for us and others and just wouldn't be right? And the Bible explains that in the sense that all of us are impacted by, and in a sense corrupted by sin. That every part of our experiencing existence post the fall, post sin entering the world, including our desires, is impacted by sin, the kind of what theologians call original sin, that concept of we are impacted by the entry of sin into the world. And that explains why all of us in all manner of areas of life, all of us in sexuality, but all of us in all sorts of other areas as well, experience these desires that are drawing us away from what is right, away from what's God's best. And so on a biblical worldview, in a sense, our desires are not a healthy or helpful and reliable guide to what is right or what is good for us.
And where would you, if somebody said, prove that please, take me to some Bible passages, where would you take us, Andrew?
Psalm 51 would be a big one, kind of David reflecting or repenting of his sin, but they're talking about having been born in sin, born in iniquity. But I think Romans 1, or Romans actually as a whole, is particularly helpful here. Now, Romans 1 is kind of painting this picture of we as humanity have rebelled against God by worshipping the created rather than the creator. We've failed in our creaturely duties, which is the essence of sin. And as a result, Paul says, God has given humanity over to sinful desires, i.e. desires pulling us away from God's plan for us. And what's really striking is he says that the kind of outworking of God's punishment of us, basically, for our rebelling of him, is giving us over, kind of abandoning us to desires. And then, of course, the gospel frees us from the condemnation for those desires. It also frees us from the power of them, but doesn't necessarily free us from those desires. And so Romans 6, you find we're no longer slaves to sin, we're now slaves to righteousness. We've died to the power of sin, and yet Paul still says you've got to not let sin reign in your body, to obey its passions, to obey its desires. And so people like us, or all of us, still experience some desires seeking to draw us away from God's plan, which were explained in Romans 1. But actually, as Christians, wonderfully, we're freed from the power. So we now have the power to choose how to respond to them and to live in faithfulness to Jesus, not kind of, as it were, in faithfulness to whatever desires we experience.
Yeah. And if anybody's sort of listening and thinking, classic sort of negative doctrine that's sort of articulated in the Old Testament and then by Paul in the New Testament, I mean, it's really interesting. Jesus is quite strong on this as well, isn't he? About, in Mark chapter 7, he talks about the central human being the central human problem being what comes out of our own hearts and the evil desires that come out of our own hearts. And that just ties in with all this teaching on original sin, that actually, we are instinctively sinners. We don't have to be taught how to harm ourselves and other people. We just do it naturally. It comes to us naturally. And Jesus himself teaches that in Mark 7, verses 20 to 23. Ashley, do you want to help us on this? In responding to this argument that if it comes naturally, it must be right to express it when it comes to our sexuality. How do you respond?
Yeah, I think I tend to say I'm talking to a non-Christian friend about this. I will tend to draw a distinction between identity and desire. Like the conversation that we're just having here, it's all about the desires that I have, and I have these sinful desires and whereas in our culture, we kind of put sexuality in a different category, and we talk about how it's something that I am. And I think that is often what trips people up. Like when I talk to even my non-Christian friends, they can get their heads around the idea that, there might be some desires that are not good in people, things like that. But we somehow see sexuality as this kind of fundamental defining thing about people rather than just a desire that we have. So I think drawing a distinction between those two things can be really, really helpful, and just helping us to go, no, this is about desires and inclinations in me. And even just using other examples. So maybe if someone like has an angry streak, we understand that that's a desire and something that they need to resist, that kind of temptation to just fly off the handle. That's not a good thing for them to lean into. Or if someone even has something like alcoholism runs in their family, for example, I know some people for whom that's the case, and we wouldn't say, oh, well, that's just who you are, so you should just lean into that then. We would kind of encourage them to resist that again, and to like engage in the struggle with that. And it might give us more understanding, more compassion to know that something is more, I guess, innate, but it does still mean that struggle does need to be engaged in.
No, thank you. And it's the other thing I suppose we probably need to say as we talk about original sin, as we talk about in the context of same-sex attraction, is that actually one of the sort of challenging things about the doctrine of original sin is it calls out us as sinners, but it actually calls out everybody. And that it's not as if original sin is just a problem for sexual minority groups, but actually Jesus is saying, the Bible's saying that original sin is a problem for all of us. And sometimes the the Christian church has implied that original sin is present in our lives because we're same-sex attracted, but not really a reality for anybody else, and that original sin, doesn't affect other people's sexualities. When one of the massive realities the Bible keeps testifying to again and again, and the life of King David in Psalm 51 would be one example of this, is how original sin has warped everybody's sexuality. Everybody's sexuality, is used in ways that's harmful to them and harmful to others. So this, as it were, is one of those hard Christian doctrines that explains things, that challenges us, but also puts us all on an equal footing. Thank you.
Just to let you know that the Living Out team's coming to Dublin on Saturday the 25th of March. This is your chance to explore sexuality in our culture, the biblical picture, and how we can support same-sex attracted Christians in our churches. Find out more and book a place at livingout.org/events.
In the second half, we're going to apply some of what we've been talking about. How does seeing the idea that if you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay as a misstep, as a mistake, how does it help us, both in our conversations with other people, with unbelievers, and actually our own sort of internal conversations as we seek to live for Christ? And at the end of this chapter in this absolutely brilliant book, there's a question, and we're going to sort of use that question just to guide our discussions of this part of the podcast. And the question is this: how can we better communicate that a natural instinct to do something doesn't mean it must be right? How can we better communicate that a natural instinct to do something doesn't mean it must be right? Let's imagine ourselves into a conversation with somebody who's not yet a Christian, and we're talking about this whole area of sexuality. How do we do that? How do we communicate that just because something feels natural, that doesn't mean it's necessarily right? Ashley, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So as I said before the break, I would use other examples, I think. So maybe like talking about anger, talking about alcoholism, things like that. I might pick a current news story, talk that through with them. So so-and-so has done this. Presumably they were acting on their natural desires. Does that make it right for them to have done it? Or you could focus in on sexuality. So I might talk about when you have sexual desires for somebody who doesn't return them. Or for my married friends, I might say, if you have sexual desires for someone who isn't your spouse, is it right for you to act on those desires? And just trying to point out in that we do all agree that there should be boundaries and limits on our instincts and our desires, that we shouldn't always indulge every desire that we have. In some cases, we should actually resist them. And then, you can draw the link back. I think I'd also want to talk about how we determine right and wrong. And I point out how when we define it for ourselves as human beings and we just follow our natural instincts, we get into a mess. Like, what do we do when my definition of what is right and wrong is different to yours? I think people literally go to war over that kind of thing. But if there is a God and he determines right and wrong, then that gives us an objective standard, and it's not one that's always going to match up to what you or I think or feel. And then, of course, when you're talking about that, you're into talking about the gospel, and you can talk about how God responds when people ignore or they don't live up to what he says about right and wrong. And you can talk about the supreme goodness of living his way, even if that means denying some of your desires, and how that's good for life now, but also after we die. And I think that's always a good direction for your conversation to take.
It is like these conversations are great evangelistic opportunities, aren't they? Because even that thing of getting someone to the place we can probably all get to of, oh yeah, there are some desires we might experience that we shouldn't act on, shows that we all have a sense of right and wrong. And actually, if we're talking to someone who doesn't even believe in God, that's a great starter. The fact that we all know there's right and wrong, and there are some things we won't really shift on that, shows there must be something outside of us that determines that. So it's immediately a great argument for the existence of God, full stop. And then I love doing the thing of when you get to that, okay, so we've got different boundaries of what sexual desire should and shouldn't be acted on. Well, why is that? Well, it's because we've got different ideas of what sex is about. I think sex is about Jesus. And I just love getting to say that, because that just really throws people of what you think sex is about Jesus. And then, as you indicated, Ashley, it's a great opportunity again to just preach the gospel. Why is sex about Jesus? Because it's this amazing picture of the union that Jesus wants with you and his desire for you, his love for you. And actually, although it's the kind of question we can be a bit scared of people asking us things around situations like this, actually it becomes this amazing opportunity to point people to the existence of God and actually even preach the gospel to them. And so it's kind of things to look forward to and be equipped for, actually, is great opportunities to talk to people who don't yet follow Jesus.
Yeah, I often find myself sort of slightly shocking people in response to this question by actually sort of saying, okay, you think it would be good for me to live out my sexual desires. Let me tell you what that would look like, because their presumption is that what I want is to settle down, in a monogamous relationship with one for the rest of my life. That's, I'm just hoping I'm not going to shock too many listeners of this podcast. That's not my sexual desires are all over the place, and the pattern. That's not what I desire. I desire sex with a lot of very attractive men, and it's been loads of different men over the course of the last however many years. And this idea of, your life, Ed Shaw, would be much better if you were just following your desires is just blatantly untrue. I would have spent the last 25 years being sexually promiscuous and causing a huge amount of harm to other people and myself if I followed my desires. So this I just sometimes shock people by saying that, and slightly probably embarrass myself by admitting too much. But this is a private conversation. Nobody else has got to think about it. That's fine. Any other illustrations people use just in conversation? I mean, I suppose I could do my stubbornness one, but you might want to go elsewhere. And any other things that you use just in conversations with unbelievers, particularly about original sin, which is has been a doctrine that people have pushed back on quite a lot in history. And any other sort of routes you might take?
We just say that sometimes I would deliberately, in the kind of other examples might be given, go broader than sexuality, just to try and get away from the caricature of Christians who are obsessed with sex and that God only cares about sex and stuff. And so just one little tip actually is we can absolutely talk about other sexual desires in here, and they're very relevant and very helpful in kind of these discussions. But also it is, I think, very worthwhile thinking broader for various reasons. Just partly is to push back against that kind of sex obsession approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I would use the example of myself in the coffee shop I regularly go to yesterday morning. Go in and they sell the best croissants in Bristol. And, the woman behind, she knows actually, if she knows that I like pain au chocolat and croissant, and she actually calls me the pain au chocolat man. Shows how much my identity is caught up in pain au chocolat. But, she was going to say pain au chocolat this morning, and I know, it's a classic example of, my desire is for a pain au chocolat. She's she's made my identity all about pain au chocolat, and I'm there going, but also know it's bad for me, and yet my desire meant that I had it, and it was lovely, but it's not good for me. Yeah, just one little example from the last 24 hours of Ed Shaw's life, and I'm glad my mum isn't listening because she's very concerned about my weight at the moment. Okay, let's move on to just taking that question and we're using it in our own lives and our own discipleship and our own efforts to, with God's Spirit help, become more and more like Jesus. How can we better communicate that a natural instinct to do something doesn't mean it must be right? How do we sort of help ourselves? Because in so many moments of our lives, we'll have a desire, to potentially be in a same-sex relationship with somebody else. We'll have a desire to express ourselves sexually, and the world around us is saying, go with it, go with it, go with it. And how do we help ourselves? How do we sort of connect everything we've been saying in our own internal conversations, if that makes sense? I found the Doctrine of Original Sin really helpful here. Of it just reminds me to tell myself that my desires lie to me. And so, it could be a sexual desire, it could be something else. It tells me the lie, this is going to make me happy, or it's going to be good for me, or is what I need, or whatever. And actually, I have to get good, preaching to myself, reminding myself, actually, as strong as this thing feels, actually it's a lie. And often I can do that, certainly from what the Word of God says, and sometimes also from past experience, where actually I've realised, no, actually giving into desires that God doesn't want me to act on never actually satisfies, never delivers. And just that thing of learning to recognise them for what they are, that they are lying to me, actually, is a really helpful and really kind of powerful strategy. And on the flip side, recognising that actually where and what and who can I trust? Well, it's God, actually. God is worth trusting. God has supremely proved his goodness in the sending of his Son. Therefore, when there's a kind of a tension between what my desires are telling me and what God is telling me, I know that God is the right one to trust. It makes sense because he's creator. It makes sense because he's proved himself to be so good and so trustworthy and to want my good. And that just helps that internal conversation, as you helpfully put it, that internal battle sometimes going on, of being able to almost reason with myself about what I'm experiencing. And is there anywhere in particular you go in Scripture on that one? Because, those moments where basically, you've been persuaded by the world around you or your own desires that actually this would be the best for you to, just to go for a same-sex sexual relationship. Where do you go in Scripture to convince yourself that actually, God always wants and has your best interest at heart?
Well, on that side, I mean, Romans 8, well, that one I go to, actually, of God having supremely proved his goodness in the sending of his son. I know God works all good things together. Why? Because he sent his son and because he's called, chosen, justified me, foreknown me, all that kind of stuff, and that chain, which I've got in the wrong order. There's that. There's three elements of Scripture that help me. One is just the supreme demonstration of God's goodness in the sending of his son, which Paul certainly brings out of Romans 8. There'd be the text in the New Testament about how we respond to sinful desires, in the sense of those drawing us away from God's plan for us. So the fact that we're called to abstain from them in 1 Peter 2. These desires, he says, that are waging war against our soul, we to abstain from them, we to flee from them, Paul says in 1 Timothy. But then also thinking of the texts that remind me of the importance as a follower of God on reflecting on and kind of actually experiencing his supreme goodness. Somewhere like Psalm 73, Asaph's reflections on actually how good it is to be near God, and that God is the one that when we've got him, there's nothing else on earth we need desire. And actually just reminding myself of, the supreme value, the soul satisfying power, I guess, of intimacy with God. So even from that moment, I feel like I'm not necessarily experiencing great intimacy with God. It's encouraging me to pursue that more actively, and also to trust that that is the thing that truly will satisfy, not acting on every desire I experience within myself.
Ashley?
I actually find the passages specifically about homosexuality in the Bible really helpful sometimes. Like sometimes my struggle with sexuality is not this kind of constant, terrible, endless, painful thing. Like sometimes it's fine, but sometimes it's harder than others, and in those times I actually genuinely find it helpful to go to these passages that are explicit about what God says about this and go, look, God has spoken, so even if how I feel doesn't line up with that, like I follow Jesus, I'm going to do what he says. I like passages as well where Paul in particular, because he does it a lot and he does it well, just kind of gospel summaries. So Ephesians 2 is a go-to for me, although other scriptures are available. So just kind of reading that and realizing this is talking about me. So, I was dead. I followed my sinful desires. I was by nature deserving of wrath, and I have been brought to life. I've been bought by the blood and the death of Jesus. This incalculably high price that was paid for me. I've been raised with him. And so just reminding myself of this good news, this incredible story, the gospel, who God is, I find that really helpful. And it if I'm sat there going, God, look, this, I can't see why this is wrong. Like, this feels really natural to me. This feels really good. I can't see why you're saying it's wrong. Just kind of reminding myself of, well, look, this is the story that I'm a part of living out. And so it makes sense to me that I'm still being transformed and renewed. So of course some of the things I want aren't right. And as well, if that is the price, Jesus' life that was paid for me, I don't really want to reject that. I don't want to squander it. If that's what I've been brought out of, I don't want to go back. So just preaching the gospel to myself over and over again from all these different angles, I just find it really helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, Joe, I was preaching at the church I'm part of a couple of weeks ago on 1 Timothy 1, which is one of the passages that does condemn gay sex. And actually I was just really struck by how it's just not a random condemnation, but actually Paul's basically doing a little exposition of the Ten Commandments. So we know that the Ten Commandments are good for human flourishing. Societies that have obeyed the Ten Commandments have been the societies where people, men and women, have most flourished. And it was lovely to be reassured of God's goodness in the Ten Commandments and how it's an application of the Ten Commandments to say that gay sex is not right. And the other thing that's actually helped me a little bit on this one is, I think we've touched on this already, is it's just an article I read, and I can't remember where it was, but years ago, that said actually one of the problems for a lot of us in the whole area of sexual desire is that actually we don't fantasize enough, which sounds slightly sort of dangerous, but their point was that we fantasize about the sexual activity, but we don't fantasize about the impact it would have on our life afterwards. We don't fantasize about waking up the next morning. We don't fantasize about the damage it would do to them and to us and to other people who we relate to. And actually, we need to fantasize a little bit more because actually that will help us reject the lie that it can't be wrong, because actually we'll be made to think through the wrong effects, the damage that would cause ourselves and other people if we just went for every desire, every longing that comes into our hearts and minds.
One other thing on that is I will sit and ask myself, what is the kind of the deeper desire here for me? Like, what's under this, like the presenting sexual desire, but what is my desire that's underneath that, and how does Jesus satisfy it? So kind of just asking that deeper question and reflecting on the biblical story of Christ and the church and where eternity is headed, and how all of those desires are going to be satisfied in full one day, and they're going to be, Jesus can satisfy them in me now as well. I find very helpful.
Oh, thanks, guys. Hey, that discussion was really, really helpful. I'm looking forward to listening to this podcast again myself and just picking up some of the more of the wisdom that Ashley and Andrew have shared. Really, really helpful. We've been discussing if you're born gay, it can't be wrong to be gay. There are living out resources that tackle this question in a little bit more depth. There's a couple of articles. Well, there's one article by me which sort of asks the question, why are some people same-sex attracted? Our friend Adam Curtis has written a great article on being born this way and really posing some good questions around that. And then I've written a short little blog about the parallel between my stubbornness and same-sex attraction, which is an illustration I often use a lot when talking about this with friends or when speaking on this, and do go to the blog to find that little resource from me. Any other resources that people have found helpful in this whole area of original sin, etc., etc., etc.? Andrew Bunt is nodding at me.
I was reminded of a book, actually, as I was talking about how it's been helpful to me to realise my desires lie to me and to battle in that way. There's a brilliant book came out last year, the year before, by John Mark Comer called Live No Lies, which is kind of a real application of the doctrine of original sin and some other important related doctrines to our lives, and then kind of actually how we live in the light of that and do spiritual warfare in our own life in the light of that. And actually one of his common examples actually is to talk about sexuality and different views in our culture on it. And genuinely one of the most helpful books I've ever read, probably actually for my own kind of walk with Jesus, including handling my sexuality, but other things as well. So Live No Lies from John Mark Comer, incredibly helpful in this kind of area.
I was going to say, I've got to note that down, and I think I don't need to. It'll be in the show notes. Brilliant. The other book, if people want to go a little bit deeper, would be Alan Jacobs from the States. His book Original Sin, a little bit more of a sort of theological and sort of cultural analysis. But I found that really helpful when I read it about 10, 13 years ago. Probably only available secondhand now, but well worth getting hold of a copy if you want to sort of delve deeper into the doctrine of original sin and see how helpful it is for living life on this earth today. Our time is tragically up for today. If you'd like to explore this misstep further, go to any of those resources, or of course do buy your own copy of The Plausibility Problem and read it for yourself. If you haven't already, shame on you. Huge thanks to the Emerging Generations team of Ashley and Andrew for joining me today. Do subscribe, share, rate this podcast if you enjoy it. Why not WhatsApp a link right now? So often we just think, I'll get around to doing that. But actually WhatsApping a link to a friend who you think might benefit from our conversation, why not do that right now? Next time, some of us, either from Emerging Generations or Submerging Generations, will be looking at misstep number 4. If it makes you happy, it must be right. The relevant chapter in the Plausibility Problem opens with some of the most contested words in the whole book. Do tune in if you're intrigued now. But for now, it is goodbye from me, Ashley and Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us.